Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Morpurgo. And I'm going to call you all ladies and gentlemen because no matter what age you are, that's what I'm calling you. And it's so lovely to see young people. Do you all read Michael's books? Can we have a show of hands? Look at that, you see, perfect.
Much more interesting to find out the ones that don't.
I wasn't going to ask, just in case.
The ones I'm going to hate.
Just in case. Can you just show me your hands as well if you've read Private Peaceful? And hands up, you can put your hands down. Hands up if you cried as much as I did. Yeah. I sat in the car waiting for my kids from school and read it and sobbed and sobbed. Michael, always a pleasure to chat to you, especially about something that is so incredibly poignant and based on truth, again, with your books.
Yes, all the books are. They all start with some kind of truth, and in this case it was a visit to a museum in Ypres in Belgium called In Flanders Fields, the best museum, I think, in the world, about a war, because it shows how it is on all sides in a war. It's very moving, and you find yourself at the end wanting to get out, but not really being able to because you're so connected to what it is that you've seen. And the last thing I saw as I came out was this letter on the wall, and it was in a frame, and it said something like, typed out, "We regret to inform you that your son, Private so-and-so, was shot at dawn for cowardice on such and such a date, 1916, signed Lieutenant so-and-so." And then I saw there was an envelope just above it, flattened out inside the frame, with the address of the mother, in Salford it was. And there was a tear, a sort of rip. And I realized at that moment, as she had opened, this mother had opened the letter, that this was the worst moment in her life. It's what every mother dreads, the death of a child. But then the manner of his dying, and that was all revealed in that moment on a doorstep in Salford, and how that must have wrecked her life, her family's life. And so I researched it a bit, and I discovered that over 300 soldiers were shot for cowardice, desertion. 2 were shot because they fell asleep. And then I read their trials. I read about 20 of these trials. None lasted more than 3/4 of an hour. One was less than 20 minutes for a man's life. Half of them weren't represented. Half of them had some nervous condition. Many of them had been in hospital already. It was searingly obvious that this was not about justice, it was about punishment. So I wrote a book because in a way I was angered about it, angered that we had all these years later not granted the wishes of the family. The families had got together to try to persuade the government to grant these people pardons because there had been no justice, there's no question about that. And so I wrote the book for that reason. I just wanted to be one of these soldiers, live the last night of my life as one of these soldiers, become a 17-year-old young man, boy really, in that war, and then trace the life of this soldier, which is what I tried to do.
Where did you get Private Peaceful from, the name?
I went on once I decided to write my story, the 2 things I needed to find out. One was the voice for writing a story. You always have to find that. I have to find that out first. How am I going to tell this? Will it be in the first person? Which character will tell the story? So that was the first thing, and I decided to write it in the first person, as I say, to become this 17-year-old. So I was writing it already and went back to Belgium to do a research trip to find out a bit more about the place where he might have lived and died. And I make it a point when I go to Ypres and places like it, never to go and just be a tourist, but to go to one of the cemeteries and walk around and contemplate a bit. And I went to one, we were driving into Ypres, about 5 kilometers outside. There was a place called the Bedford Cemetery. And I was with my wife, Claire, and we just got out of the car and walked into this drizzly cemetery, about 2,000 graves. And we were walking along, and she said, "Oh, this is interesting. Look, look, look." And there was the name, Private Peaceful. And I thought, what an extraordinary irony to have that name and be lying here. And then I thought, no, that must be the name of your central character. So I went to the museum and asked about Private Peaceful. Did anyone know this Private Peaceful? And one thing they told me was that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had spelt the name wrong, that in fact Private Peaceful had 2 L's. So I borrowed him. The family later on contacted me, and I think they were very pleased I'd borrowed him, because he'd become the unknown soldier, particularly for so many young people visiting, because they'd read about Private Peaceful, who of course isn't Private Peaceful. But they now can put a story to an unknown soldier, and a face and a life. And that is what's important in remembering, because we don't remember any of them anymore. They're all in sepia photographs now, and stuttering black and white film. We don't know them. Their names on war memorials, their names in our families, but we don't know them. So for young people now growing up, to feel connected, they have to feel connected to someone they've got to know and love. And if you read a book and you become a friend of the central character, then it means a lot to you when what happens to this man happens.
Thank you for bringing him to us, because I feel I know him so well, and his family. If we can, you just told me a beautiful story about Joe, and I think that Joe, the character, you brought him to life, and he's so magical, and I just wanted to be there, especially with Bertha and what happened with Bertha. But tell us about Joe.
Yes, it's difficult. I had my 2 brothers in my head, 2 peaceful brothers, but I wanted to create a family around them so that I could be there and witness their growing up. And for that, you need connections with, for a start, the place around you. I live in the middle of Devon. This is set in my village. Actually, it's set in my cottage. And the father who dies is a friend of mine who has not died, but worked all his life as a forester. And he's really had a bad back all his life because a tree fell on him. So I took that one step further, for instance, and the father in my story of the family dies. Don't ask me why, I just thought that was a good idea. So I had a mother alone and these 3 children. And it was important that the other child had a being in this story. But I didn't know what to make of him. I did not know how to grow this character at all. And then I got the most wonderful letter. And I'm a very lucky writer. Stuff happens. And I got a letter from a mother living up north, which means north of Watford. Actually, I think it was really up north. And she wrote a sweet letter saying that she had an autistic son, now 18 or 19, who had loved one book of mine all his life. It's a book called The Butterfly Lion. And like a lot of autistic children, they like hearing the same story again and again and again and again and again. Their favorite story, they just want to hear it again. I know an autistic child who, when he loves a book, eats it. That's how much they love books sometimes, these children. And anyway, this boy just wanted to hear this story again and again and again. And when he was happy, this boy always sang, "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's." And when he did it, he'd rock. "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's, I owe you 5 farthings." And I read that and I thought, this is my character. I just read that letter. And she said his name. His name was Big Joe. And she wrote at the end, "P.S. what my other children would really like, and he would love, is if you put him in a book. Somehow capture who this strange creature was." I don't know if any of you have autistic children in your family, but they are strange spirits. And they fly away easily. And it's difficult to be a part of their life. But when they join your family in a story and with their siblings, I think that's what she wanted, to include him in some way. So she said, "Put Big Joe in a book. Would you do that?" So I did. And all the family I found, the mother and the 2 children, loved this boy so much so that the whole family revolves around the life of this Big Joe. And he can be very annoying. He will go on singing "Oranges and lemons" when he shouldn't. And he won't eat what he should eat. And Anyway, he became the fulcrum, if you like, of the whole family.
So once you've got your family, then you bring in the outsiders, who obviously they bring into the family. So the people at the big house, the very nasty auntie, you know, all of those people. Where do you so you have the family, then how do you get from your base of your family to the people, the periphery?
Well, that happens by living in a small village in the middle of Devon, where these people sort of exist. I've read this book in the church. In fact, the play of it was played in the church. We have a one-man show of this book, and it was played in the church. And many of the people sitting there, they didn't know it, but they're the models for the people in the community. You get to know in a small village, and there are 80 people in my village, you get to know everyone, and the good, the bad, and the ugly in all of us, and it's very evident. So that wasn't difficult. I simply created that community.
But did they come up to you and say, oh, please tell me I'm not the baddie?
No, I think if they're the baddies, they don't want to acknowledge it at all. So, I mean, it happens, for instance, in my church, and it happens in lots and lots of churches. Many of you sitting here will know this, that the person who is the squire of the village, in our case, owns the most land, has the front place in the pew. Why do you think these people are sitting here? You know, I mean, it happens. You know, we may not like it, but it's gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it still goes on. And I've been at funeral services, for instance, where the squire has got up in the pulpit and spoken of someone who's worked on his land all his life, which is what happens in this story. So there's a lot of my village in this, a lot of the love in the community and the difficulty in the community, because there's always both in any community. I love where I live. I love the people too. They're just like most of us, a little bit fragile.
Now, obviously, so many of your books revolve around animals, and suddenly bringing Bertha in, I have to say, it completely broke my heart. I was in bits. I don't know if everybody felt the same with Bertha. But why bring Bertha into it?
Well, Bertha comes really because the big house where they end up working is a place called Nethercott House. It's a huge Victorian, rather ugly manor house, where in fact my wife Claire and I run a charity called Farms for City Children. City children come down and live in this great Victorian pile and think it's a palace. They just love it. And we make it as lovely as we can for them, and they work on the farm around. So this house has been the centre of our life. But I also know the people who worked in that house as under-parlour maids. By the time we got there, they were in their 60s and their 70s, but they told us the story of how it was before. And how it was before was that the master of foxhounds lived in this house. And when a hound, for instance, was no use anymore, they shot it. It was that kind of a world. And she was the under-parlour maid who, aged 14, was never allowed to go up the front stairs of the house. And when the Times came, not in the morning, because it's Devon, it always came in the afternoon, she had to iron it before giving it to the master so he didn't get his fingers inky. And all that stuff was stuff I was told. That's what's wonderful about moving into a community. You learn about the lives of people going back. So that's what it is, really. It's that in a way this house had a lot of ghosts living in it from that time. And it wasn't difficult to step back in time and be 17 and grow up on that estate with that master of foxhounds. And of course, then there would be hounds. So that's where Bertha comes from.
But was Bertha there to warn us of what was coming? We've had enough of you. You didn't do it anymore. That's it. We're taking you out.
There's a bit of that. There's a ruthlessness about quite a lot of that world at the time. There was a bit of that, yes, but it wasn't supposed to be any more significant than, I suppose, that kind of cruelty to a dog. No.
And then when they go off to war, I felt that I was there in the trenches with them, and I think the shock. I mean, we all. I'm sure most people here know the story about the young men who went off, but actually reading it and suddenly giving that young man a name, and that young man looking at the rats and the trench foot and everything that he's going through, it was painful. Was that painful for you to write?
Yes, it is painful, and I think you do have to feel it before you write it. I mean, I was out on the Somme only about 2 weeks ago, and every time I go there, it seems inevitable as you're walking in amongst these graves that you imagine the name of the person that you're reading, and you see the age, and you see the regiment he belonged to, that you imagine his life. That's the first thing you do. The second thing you do is you ask yourself the question, or I do, could I have done what these people did? So, for instance, let's talk about the 1st of July coming up. It's the centenary of the Battle of the Somme, which is the worst disaster the army of this country has ever suffered. 20,000 killed in one morning. Well, we have to sort of go there and imagine it. So you're in a trench, you're 19 years old, and the whistle blows at 7:30 in the morning, and you get up out of the trench, you all do, and then the machine guns start, and you've been told already that you have to walk. You mustn't run, you walk. And they walk forward, and the machine guns kept on firing, and they kept on falling. So to right and left of you, people are falling, and you walk on, and you walk on, and you walk on. And then you come to a grave, and it says, killed on the 1st of July, 1916. That person did that. And that makes you think, would I have done the same? And then you find out that the greatest intensity of bodies on the battlefield afterwards were on the German wire, that they simply kept walking and then the wire stopped them and they were shot down. It's just extraordinary to think of it. And you ask yourself the question, what would I have done? Would I have turned around and run off, for goodness sake? Would I have lain down? These people kept walking. What made them do that? I don't know. And your heart fills with anger that they were put in that situation in the first place, and then admiration of the courage of people who just did it. And if they did it for any reason, I suspect it was for the person to the right of them, the person to the left of them, pals. They did stuff together. I'm not sure as they were walking forward they were thinking king and country. I think they were doing it for each other, really. Would I have done it? I don't know. But when you write about it, you have to put yourself in that situation, and that's what I tried to do in this book. And there comes a moment in this book when one of the brothers disobeys an order for a perfectly good reason. I'm not going to tell you the reason, as you won't read the book. And he gets punished for it, because it's taken as disobedience, cowardice in the face of the enemy.
How important is it? I mean, you say obviously the 1st of July, it's Saturday week, in fact, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's Friday week. How important is it? I mean, there's loads of young people here, which is wonderful. How important is it that we remember?
Well, I don't think it's any more important for the young people than it is for older young people. I mean, we're all in this difficult world, and actually what's interesting is I'm looking at some people, and they're very young, and I think some of them aren't necessarily enjoying the kind of conversation we're having, because it is about suffering, and that's hard for children. It's also hard for us. But the truth is that they know now, he says, pointing at people, a great deal more about the world as it is than I ever did growing up. How old are you? 8. Lucky thing. When I was 8, just so that you know, I was 8 once. When I was 8, my mum and my dad, and we all know this, anyone who's roughly my age here, our mums and dads could corral us. They could, in a way, put their arms around us and protect us from the world outside. There was no television. There were no iPads. There were no phones. So that mums and dads, in a way, could control the world around them. So you grew up very innocent of the world out there. There may be trouble in your family, there was in mine, but even that was very often unspoken. People didn't speak about stuff much. They didn't tell children much. So you grew up much more slowly. He knows more about the world as it is now than I ever did until I was 15 or 16. Why? Because he sees what's going on the television in Syria. You can't not see it. It's there. You might press the button and turn it to The Simpsons, but but you see it, you glimpse it, you know there's suffering out there in the world, and there are troubles. And when there is, as there was this terrible assassination the other day, we know about it. Everyone knows about it. Not just the people who are old enough to know about it. And that's the difficulty, so that when you're writing for children, I think you have to, when they're very young, what do? You have to tell them stories that are comforting. That's certainly true. Hands up those of you who read The Tiger Who Came to Tea, one of my best books. No, I didn't write it. I was lying. It's in a church and I shouldn't have done it. I apologize.
What would Judith say?
What would Judith say? Anyway, the point is, we love that book because you get to the end of it and it's just a wonderful, comforting walk into the town and sitting down and having a little meal together. And the child goes to sleep, happy. But here's the problem. That child grows up and knows that there are real tigers, and then discovers, maybe watching David Attenborough or something, that people are shooting tigers. And by the time he becomes an adult, there won't be any tigers left. And suddenly the world becomes a different sort of a world. And the stories they read, I think, have to reflect that. Doesn't mean you have to make them all miserable, but it's, I think, a wonderful thing that books can do. They can enable us to empathize with other people. So if you're a boy and you read a book about a girl, you can understand girls better, and vice versa. If you're young, you can read a book about an old person and understand their life better. If you're English, you can understand more about people who are not English. It's so important, so important. And reading can do this for you.
Did you read as a child?
No, which is completely against what I've just said. I was a rubbish reader because my mum was lovely. She used to sit on my bed and read to me books like, actually there were no books like Tiger Who Came to Tea, but similar sort of books that made me happy. So I liked Kipling, I liked the Just So stories, and she loved those too, and she read them very beautifully to me. She was an actor, my mother. Actress, they called them in those days, and very, very beautiful. Well, look at me, she would have been, wouldn't she? She was wonderful, and she read beautifully, and she only read me the books and the stories that she loved. So by the age of 3 or 4, 5 or 6, I really loved stories, but then I went to a place called school. And school, I wasn't very happy with stories at school, because stories at school seemed to become this thing called spelling, or handwriting, or the worst of all, punctuation. I mean, literally, I worried about something called a semicolon. I am now 72 years old, and I still do not know what to do with a semicolon. And it's somehow that's what they tested you on. And I kept failing. And when you fail, in the end, you give up. And I gave up on stories and went out and played cricket, at which I was amazing. And rugby. I really loved all that sort of stuff. But I gave up on books until really I went to university, and I had a wonderful, wonderful professor who sat on the desk of the lecture room at King's College London, and he read me Beowulf. And he read it with the same sort of commitment and passion as my mother had read to me the Just So stories. And finally I got it all these years later, and have loved reading and writing ever since. But there was a big gap in my life. So I'm not very well read. Don't look at me like that.